I hope everybody had a good lunch. My name's Chase. I'm going to be going through how to properly set up a new Kinetic instance, how to tune that instance SQL as well as SSRS, and going through how to set up the Epicor Edge Agent. As I said, I'll be setting up a new instance, walking you through that process, performance tuning, and then setting up the Epicor Edge Agent. To begin with, setting up a new Epicor instance, I'm going to walk you through the administration console configuration, the application server configuration, what the conversion workbench does, and then how to set up task agents and the best performance for those. In the Epicor administration console, I'm going to walk you through how to add a Kinetic database server, adding a Kinetic server, and then adding or registering a Kinetic database to that server. To begin, when adding Kinetic database server, you'll want to start by right-clicking the database server management option, which is in the left here. You'll then enter the name of the SQL server that you have set up previously, and then connecting it. And depending on what you're going to use for authentication, we recommend you use Windows, but as someone a little bit more security with that, they'll do the SQL option there. If you do pick SQL here under the authentication, you'll want to enter in the service account that's going to be running the database or the owner of that database. Then click Verify Server, and you should get a confirmation page saying that it's connected, and then it'll take you back to the main administration console. Now that you've set up the database server, right-click on Server Management underneath the database server management. You'll right-click and select Add Kinetic Server. On the next screen, you'll enter the name for the Kinetic server that you're on, so the name of the server that you set up, and then you'll want to click the three dots. The three dots is going to take you to the page on the right where you're going to create a self-signed SSL certificate. You'll want to give it a friendly name, so I normally go with the server name that you entered and then Kinetic afterwards. And we recommend you leave it at 10 years as the expiration date, but you can increase or decrease that as you see fit. The reason for the certificate is for the SSL connections that Kinetic will need for the web-based menus to function. Next, we're going to register the Kinetic database with this server. Depending on what you're doing, you're either going to add a new database, so this is going to be a blank database where you're going to DMT info into, set up a new company configuration, and pretty much start from scratch. You can add a demo database. This will populate default data that Epicor provides to kind of test out the UI and get to know the system a little bit better. Or for this example, we're going to be registering an existing database. This database would have been set up in the SQL portion where you restored your current environment over to that. Next, you're going to select, so after you select the register existing database, you're going to select the three dots. This is going to communicate with SQL and find the databases that are available within that SQL server. You're going to select the database that you're going to be using for production in this example. Next, you're going to click on the deployment server, three dots, and it's going to pull up your file system. The default location is normally on the C drive Epicor ERP11, and then you'll select the ERP11.2.300 for this example, but whatever version of Epicor or Kinetic you're installing. You click that and then click OK, and then it'll take you, and then you click OK for the rest and go back. Then, since you are registering an existing database, you're going to go to the screen on the right, and you're gonna want to upgrade your Kinetic database.
Chase, before you go too far,
yeah.
Got a question for Mazine. I thought a self-service cert for Kinetic 11 was not allowed. Are they still supporting self-signed certificates?
Yes, all of the instances that I've set up recently up to 2024-1 are all allowing self-signed certs still. Once you click on the Kinetic upgrade option, the screen below will populate. What this is going to do is it's going to go through and upgrade the ICE and ERP tables and files from the current state that it's in, so the old version, and it's going to upgrade them to the newest version. I normally recommend that you click Show More and then Start. This way you can see what it's actually doing line by line. It'll have a little dialog box at the bottom. This process can take anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how far away you are upgrading to. So this version was going from 10 to 700 to 11 to 300. So it took quite a while, but that's just something to note that it can take a little bit of time to complete. Next, we're going to set up the application server. Now that we finished upgrading the database, you'll want to click the caret on the server management, right-click Kinetic Server, and then select Add Application Server. There are 4 parts to configuring the application server. You have the base server settings, the database connection, the admin console settings, and the reporting services. I'll cover each one of those individually. For the application server settings, so this would be the base settings for the server. You're going to want to add the name of the instance. So for this example, we recommend that you do the version. So this would be E11, and then what this is going to be. So for this example, it's production. Next, you're going to go to the classic client authentication. So this will be the basic or SSO. For this example, we're going to be using basic, but just so you know, that's where you would change that at. So that's the normal username and password login. I always recommend that you allow Windows authentication, so that way when you access a page, it's going to prompt you for user credentials to add a little bit extra layer of security. Next, you're going to click on the 3 dots where it says SSL certificate subject. This is where you're going to select that self-signed cert that you created earlier. And then you're going to copy and paste the SSL cert name into the DNS endpoint identity. The reason for that is so that when somebody's searching for that host name, DNS will be able to populate it and find it. For the server information, we recommend that you don't change anything here. We never change anything here, so it stays blank. And then under the application pool, this is where you're going to set what service account is going to be running your application. So you'll want to check the use custom account and enter in the username and password. The username should be the domain and then backslash the name of the user and then the normal password. For the database connection, this is where you're going to connect your application pool with your SQL database. So you're going to enter in the name of your SQL Server, and then you're going to want to leave it as Windows Authentication, or as I specified earlier, you can change that to SQL. Just make sure that it's going to be the same service account that's the owner of that database. Then you'll click the little arrow here on the right side of the database name. This will populate the databases that it has access to, and you'll be able to select, in this instance, the 11 prod, and then you'll want to test the connection, and it'll prompt a confirmation page to appear. For the admin console settings, this is where you're going to set up the manager account. You'll want to make sure that you document this password and save it somewhere, as this is pretty much the God right account for Epicor. It's not recommended that this gets changed very often or ever. It causes a lot of problems if it's not done properly. So we just say set it and leave it as is for as long as you can. And then the rest of the page you'll leave the same. For the reporting services tab, so this is where you're going to set up the report server connection and create the reports database and the subfolder directory for your report server. So you want to click the configure SSRS, and then in the SSRS web service URL, you'll input the SQL database server that you set up. Same with the SSS web portal, you'll put the same SQL server. And then for the SSRS root folder, you're going to want to make it the name of the database that you're creating. So in this instance, E11 prod, but that would be E11 test, E11 pilot. The reason for this is when you access your report server, the browser, you'll be able to differentiate which reports are where, along with if you have any data sources that are going to be used separately, you can separate them out with that. For the SSRS database connection, you're going to enter in the SQL database name again, leave it as the Windows authentication or SQL, depending on what you're using. And then you're going to use the same name for the database, E11 prod, but then add reports after it. This way you can differentiate the database names in SQL later on. You'll want to click Create Database, and then obviously test the connection again. This way you know that it's connected and has access to make that server. Next, so a little tidbit here, I noticed when setting up a 2024 1 instance, they've removed the import reports option. So you no longer get to decide if you want to import the default reports that Epicor provides. They automatically get imported every time you deploy an instance, which if you're trying to troubleshoot and you need to redeploy the application pool, can be a bit of a nuisance because it does make it take longer to redeploy. But in this instance, since we're creating a new instance, you'll want to check that for import reports. And the default location, depending on if you're on a separate box For this example, SQL and Epicor on different servers. So you'll UNC path to the report server folder, but if it's on the same server, it's going to be under the C drive, program files, Microsoft SQL Server Services, SSRS, and then the report server. After that, we recommend that you go through each of the tabs again, review the information, make sure it's right, make sure you have everything in the right order, and go ahead and click deploy. Once that runs and finishes, you're going to want to click OK. Don't click the X. If you click the X, you run the risk of it not actually deploying and having to restart the process all over again. That's a small bug that we've noticed from time to time. Once you have the application server set up, and it'll have an app will populate on your desktop, you'll want to go and open that, and it'll bring you to this. It'll prompt you, say it needs a data conversion. Do you want to run that? You'll click yes, and then you'll go to make sure that all of the ones that aren't fully at 100% are checked, and you'll click actions run pending conversions. This will take another 15 to 20 minutes to run. This is going to convert your data from what it currently is and make it usable with the Kinetic UI. After that, you're going to want to go to the user run conversions, check any of the ones that aren't done, and then click actions and run pending conversions again. This way, everything is converted and nothing errors out in the future. And it'll also let you know if there's no check mark, it'll have warnings or errors. There are some that you can get away with erroring, but one that you really can't get away with, if it errors, you'll want to restart the whole process of restoring your database and setting up a new application server is the GL codes. The reason for that is if you don't have your GL codes working, your system's not going to work very well. Next is on to setting up the task agents. When creating a task agent, the first time you click on this button under the administration console, it's going to ask you to install the service. You're going to click OK. It's going to run. It's going to do that. Then you're going to click on the button again. Then you're going to click on the file, new task agent. Here, this information should all populate. The only thing that won't be there is the user ID and username and password. We recommend that you create an account called the print account. This will have session impersonation enabled so that the sys agent can run it and use it. So when you enter this, this way you don't use the manager account, because you don't want your manager account to be running everything that's going on your server, all the reports, anything that's going on in your system. It's preferable that your manager account's not using it. And for a performance standpoint, you're going to want to make sure that you have, for production environments, you're going to want to have 3 task agents. And then for test and pilots, you're only going to have 1. That way, if somebody's running a larger task that's going to take a little bit of time to run, no other tasks are getting held up in the queue, and the other task agents will take it over and get everybody running smoothly while that other one's occupied. Now, we're going to be moving on to the performance tuning section. We're going to be going over your server tuning. So this is the base server with Windows OS. Then we'll go into SQL tuning. Then we'll go into the Kinetic tuning. For SQL Server tuning, you're going to make sure that your power plant is set to high performance. This is just to ensure that it's using all of the resources it has as effectively as it can. You're going to make sure that in your adapter settings that NIC teaming is enabled. This is so that your pipeline is not as constricted on a virtual machine. For system reboots, we recommend that you reboot and run updates every 30 days. Windows has their updates the first Tuesday of every month. So that's normally about the time when we would recommend that you restart the servers, just to get those out of the way as soon as possible. The longer you let it run without getting a reboot, the slower the system might become. As all things do, they need a break to reset and clear caches, and that'll help performance quite a bit.
Hey, Chase, got another question for you. Do we still need to create a second app server to use SSO? So it used to be you had to have one for the manager type of account, and then you had a second one for your SSO.
Yes. I haven't heard any different. I believe that is still the case. You'll need 2 different application servers for SSO still. Next on the list is disk space. As long as your disks are all under 80% full, they're running at the ideal performance. If you let them get too full, it can bog down performance, especially if you have log files that are too big. Backups won't run if the backup drive's too full. And you'll notice that if the logs are full, or the log drive's full, SQL won't query things very fast. And you'll notice that Epicor will start running slower because it can't, for example, MRP can't write to the log file, it can't grow. And you'll notice that your MRP will take hours or never finish running at all. That's an example that I've seen quite often. For your visuals, this is done in your control panel and then advanced computer settings. You'll want your visuals adjusted to best performance. Normally you don't have a background on your computer, but I've heard horror stories of somebody having a animated background on their server and wondering why their performance is bad. Well, if you that's going to take up resources to run, so it's best just to set this to best performance and leave a blank background. And then you want to optimize it in your advanced settings under performance options to background services. This way, SQL and Epicor can run the background services that they need at an optimal performance rather than it being focused on program intensive if they're not actually running openly on the server. Now we'll be going into the SQL tuning. This section, I'm going to walk through the SQL Configuration Manager, the SQL Server properties, maintenance plans, the SQL agent, and then some security tidbits. For the SQL Configuration Manager, you'll want to make sure that all of your services are set to start automatically. This can be done also in the services or the Microsoft Services section, but this is a good place to check if they are. Full text filter Diamond normally doesn't give you that option when creating SQL or when creating a SQL server, so you'll have to turn that on to automatic in the services section regardless. Next, you'll want to make sure that all of your protocols are enabled. So you'll want to click on all the carets here and just click on client protocols and make sure that these are all enabled. Moving on to the SQL Server properties, how you will locate this is when you open up SQL Server Management Studio, the server that you connect to, you'll want to right click that and then go to Advanced and then click on the A through Z option. These are important to ensure that SQL is running your backups, Epicor properly, and just making sure that it's optimized for Epicor. You'll want to make sure that your cost threshold is for parallelism is set to 50. You want to make your max degree of parallelism set to 2. That way it's always enabled, but it's not over compensating for anything. And you'll want to make sure that your SQL is optimized for ad hoc workloads. Under the database settings, you'll want to make sure that you are compressing and running checksums on all your backups. This is to help prevent bloat and corruption in your backups. And you'll want to also make sure that your files are going to the correct file locations. We normally recommend that everything has its own drive to go to. So you have a data drive, a log drive, and then a backup drive, as well as a TempDB drive, along with your OS C drive. You also want to make sure that your system isn't using up too much memory. Otherwise, this can cause Epicor not to run if they're on the same box. If SQL is trying to take up too many resources, this will be done under the Memory tab. We recommend that SQL gets about 62% of your memory. OS system gets 10%, and then Epicor gets the rest. For your TempDB files, we recommend that those are set for a specific drive. You turn off auto growth, and you set the cumulative size of those files should be 80% of that drive. That way, they never grow, they don't grow out of sync, and you don't have to worry about any issues with that. A note also is that your max degree of parallelism, ad hoc, and cost thresholds can also be set at the database level. So per database, you can change that. And then whatever's set on that database level will override the server set settings. Going into your maintenance plans, you'll have an hourly, which will do your transaction logs. You'll have a daily, which will do a full backup and cleanup if you like. And then your weekly will also do a cleanup. And I'll go a little bit more deeper into that. For the hourly, recommend that you start running a few hours before business hours start and stop running a few hours after to ensure anything that may get done before business day or after the business day is caught for your point in time recovery. And we recommend that your daily backup run at 1 a.m. every day to ensure that you capture everything before the day begins. The reason you'll want a daily BAK file to run before your hourly is that way is because transaction logs get flagged to that full backup. And so if you do have a system outage or system down event, you can go back and depending on what time this happened, so let's say it happened at 1:30, you could go back and restore, and you'll have your full day backup, and you'll have those hourly backups to one, and you'll only lose about 30 minutes of data versus whole day or hours worth of it. The weekly plan should run every Sunday at 1 a.m. While this is to ensure that nothing else is running, as this is going to be a longer process and it allows the maintenance plan to run without interruption. We normally set it up to run Halligan re-indexing and update statistics. This is a T-SQL execute that utilizes stored procedures on a utilities database that is created. We recommend that it does log cycling. This is to clear out any old logs that SQL might be holding on to. This way you can prevent any log bloating that SQL might be causing. You'll want it to take a BAK and TRN cleanup. This way you can clean up any old backups and transaction backups that aren't needed anymore. We normally recommend that you have 2 weeks worth of backups, but depending on space, you can limit this to a week or a few days, depending on what your company sees fit. You'll want it to run database integrity checks. This will ensure that your databases are all still in good condition. None of them are corrupted. There's nothing wrong with them. And then you'll want it to run a full backup. This way you'll have a fresh start for the week. If anything were to happen on Monday, you'll have a backup for Sunday, since Sunday. And then you'll want to run SP Blitz. This is another T-SQL execute. What this does is it will look through your database and find any issues or errors that are going on, and it'll report back to you, such as log files are greater than your database file, stuff like that. It'll give you more insight into what's going on in your SQL server.
And Chase, if we could step back to the files, Mazine had a question, what about a VM environment? So do we still need your separate data log and backups?
Separate data log and backups.
You recommended a separate drive for data, log files, and backups, but what about in a virtual environment?
So in a virtual environment, it's still recommended to split them up. That's the recommendation that we make to everybody, even if they're not on virtualization. The reason for this is so you don't run the risk of running out of storage space on one drive. You can split that up into two. It's not uncommon for people to put them on the same drive. It's fairly normal, so something you can do. It's just a recommendation that we like to make to have them separated.
One more question from Monty. How much RAM should the SQL Server have for Kinetic?
So the SQL Server, we normally, if they're running on the same box, we recommend 128 gigabytes of RAM. This way you can give SQL ample amount. 62 gigabytes is what we go with normally, or 90. It can be either of those. This way, SQL has enough RAM to run efficiently, and it's not going to interfere with Epicor or the OS system. If you're running it on separate boxes, you can get away with 64 gigabytes of RAM, and on both boxes to run them separately.
And some of that depends on what you're doing with Epicor and SQL, because the more memory you can give SQL, it'll cache anything that it can. So it's just going to help your SQL performance. Now, we also have seen people that their entire database has been loaded into memory because they just don't have a large one. So there is a cost-benefit analysis, so to speak. There's a point where you're just throwing more memory at it and it's not going to do anything because your database just won't fit in that memory.
Going into the SQL agent, this is a very important part of SQL that should be set to auto start, or your jobs won't run. So maintenance plans create jobs. You can create your own jobs to run things. It should be set to auto start. If SQL unexpectedly stops, or if you restart the server, it'll come back up on its own. You'll want to make sure that you have an operator enabled and that you have notifications enabled for that. This way, if anything goes wrong in your system, you get notified of those alerts and severities via email in that event. Make sure that you have alerts and severities set up as well here. This way you can dictate what information you get. I know severity 16 is normally letting you know that backups didn't run. Hopefully don't ever have to see these, but they're good to have enabled. And then you'll want to make sure that you go through all of your jobs and make sure that when the job completes, it sends you an email. Now you might be wondering why you don't want to just get emails when the job fails. This is so because you probably won't get in the habit of looking at it and you'll see it and you'll be like, it's nothing. But if you notice when you're getting constant emails and you notice you don't get one, you won't miss it because you'll be like, that didn't run. Why didn't I get a notification that it ran? So it's a good reason to have that enabled that way. For security, it's highly recommended that you utilize AD groups as much as possible to allocate access to specific groups rather than giving a single individual access, so you can manage that a little bit better. So let's say you have a group of DBAs, you have a DBA admin group. If you have individuals that need specific access for SSRS reports, but you want them to have a little bit more permissions than, let's say, a normal user would, if the normal user would have access at all, you can give that to them there rather than giving it to a specific person. For the service accounts, when you set up SQL, it's going to ask you to create a NT service account. And it's just good to make sure that you have that documented and stored somewhere in the event that you can't log in, somebody locks you out of SQL, your domain is down, and you need to get into SQL to figure out to make sure that Epicor is still running. It's good to know who has that NT service account to log in with and make sure that you still have access to SQL. For Epicor tuning, I'm going to go through the administration console and the Epicor application itself. There isn't a whole lot to do in Epicor for tuning itself. Most of it's going to be done on the SQL side for performance, but there are a few tips and tricks that I will show you that'll help your system. In the admin console, when you connect to the Epicor instance and use the drop-down caret, you'll want to select the license option and then select properties for your license. You'll then want to make sure that you have country-specific functionality enabled. Under the country-specific functionality, you'll just click Show License and just make sure all the countries that you're licensed for are enabled. This way, your Epicor application has those specific functionalities accessible to you in your system. And then in that same caret, you'll want to click on the companies option. So I know a lot of people might have several companies. Some might only have one, but it's good to go through each one and then click opt out of the telemetry tracking. This way, you're not sending any information. This will prevent Epicor from collecting or transmitting any data that you don't want it to, and it'll help speed up your system a little bit. And then, as I explained earlier, for the task agents, you're going to want to make sure that your production environment has 3. Your test and pilot instances only have 1. This way, anything that gets run, if it's running slow, it's not going to pause your system from being able to run any other reports or tasks. In the Epicor application itself, you can go to a few different locations to find your license info. If you go to the Home and About section, you'll find it. If you go to Company Configuration, you'll find it there as well. And you can also find it in your admin console. The example above is when you go to your company configuration. Reviewing your licensing information can be good for grasping how many licenses you're using and how many you have. Epicor normally recommends that if you have 100 to 150 users with Epicor, it recommends that you should split your SQL and Epicor environments onto 2 separate servers. This way you're utilizing your resources a little bit better. And then when going through your password policy, let's say you have a user that gets locked out or can't remember their password, we find it that if you allow blank passwords on reset, it makes the whole situation a lot easier. They don't have to remember a password you give them to put that in and then type in their new one. It'll just allow them to enter in a blank one, and then they enter in the new one they want to use, and everybody goes on with their day. And then we're going to move into setting up the Kinetic Edge Agent. Before we begin, this is going to be a walkthrough on how to set up the Edge Agent for network printing. The Edge Agent's still relatively new. To begin, I have some important knowledge that's not readily accessible from Epicor. I found this out when setting it up. But if you are on the Epicor cloud, you have to request from them that the Epicor Edge Agent is enabled, or else you'll be able to download it, set it up, but you just won't get the functionality for it. Same goes with the multi-tenant. Multi-tenant cloud members cannot use network printing at all. I'm not sure why that is, but I found that out the hard way after setting it up for a client. We got to the end of it, and Epicor told them they couldn't use it. So that was good to know now. And then with the new 2024 1 or any browser Kinetic version, the Edge Agent is required to open up some menus. It's going to open up a smart client menu for you. The reason the Edge Agent is required for that is so that it can access your system. The setup that we're doing today isn't going to be specific for that. You'd want to set up your Edge Agent in local mode on the workstation rather than in server mode on a server. And I'll explain that a little bit further later. To find the download for the Edge Agent, you're going to want to navigate to the company maintenance menu and then go to the overflow menu, which is the three dots here. And you're going to want to select the download for which OS system you're using, Windows or Mac OS. If you are downloading it from the smart client or the application itself, you'll be able to dictate where you want this download to go. If you download it from the browser menu, it's just going to go to your default downloads folder. Now that you've downloaded it, if you didn't download it to your Epicor server or the server that has access to all of your network printers, you'll want to move that download there before beginning the install. Once you have the agent on that server, you'll want to launch it. And the first prompt, you'll want to select network install. This way it installs the agent in server mode to utilize for network printing. As I specified before, if you're using it for the browser instance, to open up menus, you'll want to do it on the local install option. Then you'll click next. Once you're on the app server configuration, you're going to want to enter in the name that you want the agent to use. This will come with a default name, but you can change it as you see fit. But I recommend leaving the Edge agent at the end so you can differentiate it from other agents that you have running. Page after that, you're going to want to enter in the name of the application server and then the app server URL. You can find the app server URL in the admin console. When you click connect, it'll be in that little box there. You go ahead and copy and paste that there. And then you'll want to leave the authentication type as basic. But if you select the identity provider authentication, you'll need to enter in the client ID and client secret that the Edge agent will use to connect to the server. As you can see here, that's that option. But if you stick with the basic, it's going to take you, this prompt won't show up otherwise. Once you input the information, you'll click next and then finish. And then this will prompt a confirmation page that it's been set up and installed properly to appear on your screen. Then you'll go back into your Kinetic app and you'll want to navigate to your printer maintenance and then go to the overflow page and you'll want to click on Browse Edge Printers. Once in the overflow menu, you click the Edge. Once the Edge printer panel comes up, in the drop-down menu, you'll want to select the Edge agent you created. And as long as the server you installed it on has access to your network printers, once you press to search, the printers that it has access to will appear, and you'll select one to set up. Once you do that, this will prompt the printer details card to show up, and this will show you the network path for the printer that the Edge agent is going to use to connect. And you just want to confirm that all this information is correct, and then you'll click Save. And then now your users will be able to select this printer in the overflow menu of whatever menu they're on. They'll be able to click Network Print and be able to select that printer to print from. Some common errors that you'll see when installing the Edge agents are the ones listed here. If you see any of these, Epicor recommends that you go and just go through the reinstall process of the Edge agent and hopefully mitigate that. Unfortunately, the documentation for that doesn't specify any other fixes other than just reinstalling. Are there any questions?
I wanted to make one more comment about the Edge agent that we have found. Because we are such a mixed mode of classic and kinetic screens, I haven't found a pattern to it yet, but I know on regular occasions, the Edge agent just loses connection. Sometimes you're able to just go in and get it connected again, but it is kind of annoying for the user when that does happen.
Okay, we got a couple others. From Mickey, is this a service for which Epicor charges or part of package? I think she's talking the Edge agent. That is free, isn't it?
It's free.
Microsoft.
Yep, it's free through the Epicor app. That's where you grab the download from. I think on every instance that I've installed that's 11 or higher. Now, I could be wrong on that, but you should just be able to go to that overflow menu in your company, in the company maintenance overflow. That should be an option that everybody has access to see.
Another question you have here, Chase, is from Andreas. Was auto growth set to yes or no? You mentioned, but he didn't catch it.
For TempDB, I think that was the only auto growth I talked about. But for TempDB folder files, we recommend that you have auto growth set to no or off. That way you can ensure that none of those files are going to be full. Just to reiterate, the reason for this is TempDB, I can't remember the exact wording, but Fred, you might be able to explain that one a little bit better. But you want it to take up 80% of the drive it's on and leave it at that. You don't want it to change. You don't want it to be able to grow or shrink on its own, as it can cause problems in the system.
I love this thing. As soon as I type an answer, I get muted. So with TempDB specifically, you want it to be the maximum size that it's going to be, which is why we tend to put it on its own drive. So it takes up all of the drive except for the 20% you need to stay free for the OS. So the reason that you want it to be as big as it's going to be is because let SQL use it. Anytime SQL has to grow a file, it actually pauses the system. And since tempdb is used by everything for sorting, stored procedures, things like that, then it'll basically pause the entire system. So when SQL Engine starts up, if it allocates all that space in one shot, boom, you're set. So that's why you want to turn it off and have it just be the size that it is so that you're set for life. Other files, your regular database files, for when it's a larger style of database, you'll want your MDF or your data file to grow in 256 meg chunks and your log file to grow in 128 meg chunks. And the reason for that is because, again, when it has to grow, it pauses the system, has to allocate the space. There's actually a lot more that goes on, and then it lets the system go on. So although it's a very quick process, if it has to do it repeatedly because you're doing small chunks and your database is growing constantly, you're pausing a lot. If you grow it too large, then it takes a long time to allocate that space and you're paying for it when you don't necessarily need to. In general, the 256, 128 chunks are good recommendations. Doesn't mean they apply to everything. You may find in your system you need a different setup. So just keep an eye on it. Those are kind of like recommendations to go with. From Karen, is it possible to install Edge Agent on a workstation and have two different domain users log in and use Edge Agent?
Agrees. You set it for all users, not a specific.
And Ed says he thought that the multiple users was fixed in 2024-1.
And 2 comments up from Karen is saying they've started installing the Edge Agent locally for all users, and it seems to work much better than just installing for a specific.
From Monty, is there an instance where you would suggest a 3-server setup? SQL, Epicor, and Task Agent.
I don't think I'd recommend that. I've never seen a reason to, but I do know that it's possible. I know we've set them up before, but I don't see really the reasoning behind that. The services don't take up that much space.
We used to have it when we were in 10.2.600 and below. We used to have a SQL application server, and then we routed all our tasks through a third server. We did go away from that in 24.1 and have not seen any issues with it. We do still have 2 servers, one for the database, one for the database, one for the application right now.
Not a separate task server, do you?
Not in 24.1.
And how many users do you have?
85 full and 55 MES.
There you go. So when you break over 100 users, I would see a dual server, app server one, SQL server the other. When you start getting over 200, I'll see people break out a task server again.
Okay. So then that would be the event that you would want to have a third task server is if you have 200 or more users running it. So
sending
that way
tasks to it, yep.
Yeah, running tasks to it so you can allocate the resources it's needed.
Now, as a web-based application in 24.1, probably could keep it down to 1 because IIS is going to be doing its own load balancing.
Okay, and from Rob, with the Edge Agent download off of company maintenance, do you need a separate agent per company in a multi-company environment, or is one Edge Agent sufficient?
The Edge Agent went to the server, not to the company, wasn't that?
I do when we do the local installs, we just have one for no matter which company we switch to.
Then with that, I would assume then only one. You'd probably I think you'd only need to install it from one company, and then just install the Edge Agent on each company because you're going to specify which app it's going to, and whichever user's logged in, it's going to use that user's information.
When you do have multiple servers, so we have multiple environments for test and dev and production, you do want to make sure that those are all 3 specified within the URLs within your one Edge Agent.
Yeah, and I want to say in the Edge Agent, you could only do 4 URLs maximum.
Yeah,
Correct.
And that's not a screen that I had since I didn't set the demonstration up for the local installs, but I believe if I remember right, there is when you set it up for the local install, you can set up 4 different app server URLs.
That's correct.
I think the reason they just put it on company for download was they needed somewhere, and there's nowhere that says across all companies. So they
The
just
other
put it
thing,
on the company.
yeah, the other thing that happens if you try to open a classic form and you don't have the Edge agent, you have you'll get a screen that will allow you to download the agent there too.
Yeah, but do you get that one to work? When I
That-
try to use that link, it never seems to download and install correctly.
That's the one I've used, I would say, maybe way too many times already, but yes, I've got it.
We were getting that with Configurator, and it would never pull it down.
What settings or best practices do you recommend when managing services on your server that runs your application in SQL Server? For example, setting print spooler's recover setting first failure to restart the service. I think it's on the server itself. There's a print spooler service, and it might have a recover setting. So in general, Michael, it's kind of going to depend on the service. The best practice is if you're not using it, don't run it. So in the case of your SQL server, it shouldn't really be your print server. So I would think you wouldn't need the print spooler running at all. But there are other services that it does require. So you kind of need to go through and analyze what services you don't need. But that's across the board of turning off anything you don't need on any server. So if you don't need certain things, just turn those services off or set them to disabled or manual so that they don't impact the performance of your server, and you'll get a little bit better performance. So you might just have to research some of the specific things. If you are a print server, without digging into it, restarting after the service fails sounds like a good idea on the print spooler, just so that you don't have to go in and manually do something. It'll restart on its own. All right. Well, I got 2:30. Ready to start something, Calvin?
Time to go to the dentist.